Welcome to all of you to this session tonight. We're privileged to have four excellent panelists, and I think we'll have a very stimulating discussion about manufacturing, not only in the United States, but outside the United States as well. So we have caucused and try to organize and provide a framework for our discussion tonight. So we're going to start with Arvind Kaushal, who's a partner at Booz Company. Arvind has participated or led this study with Conrad and others at Booz on manufacturing. So he'll be able to give us sort of a state of the land, so to speak, how manufacturing is doing, has been doing, expected to be doing. So he'll give us some background information in 5 minutes. And then we're going to shift to the policy side, and Clyde Prestowitz, who's here as president of the Economic Strategy Institute, of course, is from Washington, as was mentioned before. So he's our policy expert. People in Washington focus on policy, and we're delighted that Clyde could be here with us. And then we'll turn to Jenny Scanlon from USG and Tim Gardner from Illinois Toolworks. They're actually working in manufacturing firms, so they can give us sort of some first-hand insights into what's happening in manufacturing from people who, as they say, meet payrolls. So with that, we've asked each one to speak for about 5 minutes, and then I'll start asking some questions, and we'll have some interaction here on the podium, and then we'll open this up to questions from all of you. So, Arvind?
Thanks, Michael. So I'm delighted to be here to talk about manufacturing. And if you look at the amount of optimism and opportunity which there is in manufacturing right now, I don't think there has been a time where there has been so much excitement about manufacturing. Let's look at a couple of examples. If you look at what GE is planning to do in Appliance Park in Louisville with $1 billion in investment, Caterpillar is planning to bring back 1,400 jobs to Georgia from Japan. Ford is planning to bring back 12,000 jobs from China, Mexico, and Japan. And you look at all those examples, it is clear that the tide is turning. I think the question which is facing us is, what can we do to make sure that this change which we're seeing right now is sustainable? It's not something which we see and then it goes away. But I think before we get to that, one of the questions which a number of people ask is, does manufacturing really matter? Why bother about it? Let's do something else. And I would like to point out 3 facts which highlight why manufacturing is important. If you look at the US GDP, 11% of the US GDP is driven by manufacturing. Now, on top of that, if you include the multiplier effect of transportation, technical services, and so on, a quarter of US GDP is manufacturing driven. If you think about innovation, manufacturing actually funds and fuels innovation. A National Science Foundation study found that 70% of private R&D is actually done by manufacturing companies. And I think lastly, there is tremendous amount of opportunity here. Right now, this number may shock some people, but we actually do produce 75% of what we consume as a nation. But our research suggests if we actually do the right things, this number can actually go up to 95%. So it's clearly important. And what's also interesting is if you look at the trend of jobs in manufacturing in the US, for the first time in the last 10 years, we actually see a consistent uptick. So since January of 2010, where we hit a low, we have about 500,000 jobs which have been added in the sector. So taking into account all of these things, I think the next question is, why this optimism? Why are companies actually spending billions of dollars or plan to spend billions of dollars in US manufacturing? And our belief is that this is actually driven by 3 primary economic reasons why the tide is turning. First of all, if you look at labor, the wage rate gap between US and China and other Asian countries is narrowing. Wages in China are growing at 15 to 20% year on year. If you look at the cost of logistics, a barrel of oil now is 3 times as expensive, adjusted for inflation, as it was in 2000. And I think lastly, but most importantly, a number of smart companies are actually getting very thoughtful about the intangibles. And they're incorporating those intangibles in their decision making. What do I mean by intangibles? So if you look at things like complexity of a long supply chain, what does it do to delays, ability to forecast accurately? If you think about the vulnerabilities of putting everything in one basket, Eduardo, you talked about the tsunami in Japan. I think also the second thing which companies are realizing is the advantage of being able to bring together designers, manufacturers, and customers together to drive innovation, to reduce costs, and to reduce complexity. Lastly, things like intellectual property rights matter and ability to respond to changes in demand. So all of those things point towards some of the drivers which are bringing manufacturing back. I'd like to spend a little bit time on GE. If you look at what GE is doing in the Appliance Park in Louisville, it's very thoughtful. For the first time since 1957, they've actually started new manufacturing operation in Appliance Park in Louisville. And what they've done, they've not just moved a product from China to the US, but they actually brought together designers, engineers, salespeople, customers, plumbers, and everyone together to actually fundamentally redesign this product where it has less weight, it is easier to install, it actually has a lot more consumer convenience features, it connects to the smart grid, and the product made in the US will retail for $300 to $400 less than when it was made in China. So there's a significant benefit for the consumer with this move as well. So let me kind of close by saying that while we see these trends, the key question is, so how do we make this sustainable? What do we need to do as companies and as policy-making bodies? I believe there are three things. First of all, I think companies need to think about manufacturing as a core part of how they win. I think for a long time, we've actually neglected manufacturing. It's something you have to do because if you are in the business of selling stuff, you got to make it. But as we have clearly seen, because we've worked with a lot of companies on this topic, you can actually make manufacturing a key part of how you compete, whether it is through response times, it's through customization, and you can actually build fundamental capabilities in this space. I think the second thing which needs to happen is companies need to look at the economics now, not from a lens of 2000, but actually 2015 and beyond, because the economics have changed significantly. And you got to be able to look at those new economics when you're making decisions. And frankly, in some ways, I think the growth in China is actually an advantage. Because when you think about the growth in China and you think about adding another plant or adding capacity, that's actually the perfect opportunity to repurpose your plants. Use the plant in China for the growth in China and think about adding capacity in the US for US. And I think lastly, I would say there are a lot of roadblocks for manufacturing, real things which need to be addressed. It includes issues around talent. It includes issues around our tax structure. It includes issues around regulation and so on, which needs to be addressed. So with this, I would like to hand it over to Clyde.
Arvind, thank you very much. Clyde?
Okay, well, thank you. Just to follow on from where Arvind left off, the reason that the U.S., a major reason that the U.S. has suffered a decline in manufacture, and to respond to Arvind's question about what needs to be done, is that we've had a kind of an anti-industrial policy. You often see discussion of this in terms of should the government pick winners and losers, and this is always a hot debate in American political terms. But the truth is that the U.S. government, for a very long time, since the 1950s, through Democratic and Republican administrations, it is absolutely not partisan. Believe me, I've served in both Republican and Democratic administrations. On this issue, it's not partisan. They all think alike. And there are two major factors. One is that the priority of the United States, the overwhelming national priority of the United States, is not economic. It's national security. It's geopolitical. It's alliances and playing the great global game, moving troops and governments around. Let me give you just an example of what I mean. In the late 1980s, the U.S., of course, was developing a substantial trade deficit. The I was in the Reagan administration, Counselor, Secretary of Commerce at that time. And like President Obama just recently, President Reagan decided to establish a task force to seek out and stop unfair trade. We called it the Strike Force, and I was made the chairman of the Strike Force. And my job was to find unfair trade and smite it down. And there was the Airbus, heavily subsidized by the Europeans, in violation of various international undertakings, a big sitting duck. And so we made preparations to make complaints against the Airbus and to take retaliatory steps against Airbus subsidization. Before proceeding with these steps, there was a meeting of the appropriate White House people. And I remember it because George Shultz was then Secretary of State. He never came to these meetings, but he came to that one. And after I finished my presentation, Secretary Shultz said, "Stop, we're not going to do this. It would shatter NATO." Keep in mind the French were not in NATO at the time. But we didn't do anything because the overwhelming priority was geopolitical. It wasn't Boeing and Airbus, it was NATO. Fast forward to November 2009, President Obama is in Shanghai, his first trip to China. He's holding a joint press conference with President Hu Jintao. And I'm listening to the press conference, I'm doing some other things, but I'm listening with one ear. And so it's got a blah, 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 blah. And then I hear the president say, "And we have agreed to help China develop its own domestic commercial aircraft." And blah, 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 blah. And I perked up and I said, "What? What? Aircraft are one of the few things we can sell these guys? We're going to help them build their own airplane? Why is that?" So I followed up. I talked to Kurt Campbell, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. And, Kurt had a variety of responses, but essentially the response was, well, they're only going to build a little airplane and it's not advanced technology. And, we need the Chinese to help us with North Korea and with the Iranians. And again, it was all a geopolitical response. So part of what's going on here is that the policy environment is one that trades off economic interests, particularly manufacturing economic interests, against the geopolitical objectives. Second element here is that American economic doctrine, free trade, classic neoclassical free trade doctrine, essentially holds it doesn't matter what you make. A good quote, all the people who have been accused of making this statement deny making it, but if they didn't, they should have, because it captures their thinking. And the quote is, "Potato chips, computer chips, what's the difference? They're all chips. Wood chips, chocolate chips, computer chips." If the Japanese are subsidizing semiconductor chips, well, let them have the semiconductor chips, go make wood chips or something. The notion that it matters what you make is not a very strong notion in Anglo-American neoclassical economics. And so hence, we tend in our trade negotiations not to do our trade negotiations with any hierarchical set of productivity or technological issues. Whoever comes into the U.S. trade rep's door first, who has the strongest lobby with the most clout, tends to get their issue, the squeaky wheel gets the most grease. And so we don't tend to pay much attention as other countries do. Let me just close with one final example that makes this point. You've all heard of the iPhone, I guess, and you've probably seen these analyses about where the iPhone is made. And of course, when it comes into the US, it's recorded as being made in China because we import it from China. But the analyses have pointed out that a $400 iPhone, or $200, I guess, only about $7 worth of the value added is done in China. So that's the labor. And of course, the Chinese labor is inexpensive, but the rest of that iPhone doesn't get made in China. Where does it get made? the parts and components largely come from Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. These are not low labor cost markets. And these products, digital signal processors, electronic displays, semiconductor memory chips, these are not labor intensive. They're totally capital intensive. Samsung is not a lower cost producer of chips than Intel or than Micron Technology. So how come all these Apple parts are being made in Asia rather than in the US? And a big reason is policy. A big reason is because the Asian producers tend to have very supportive governments. They tend to get special tax breaks and preferential financing that in various ways reduces their costs. Or, one final example, Jeff Immelt, chairman of GE, also chairman of the President's Commission on Competitiveness and Jobs. So with that hat on, Jeff's job is create fine jobs in America. And with giving Jeff due credit, GE has been among the companies that has paid attention to bringing some manufacturing back. But just recently, Immelt announced that GE is moving its avionics division globally into a joint venture with China's state-owned company AVIC. AVIC has not hitherto done anything in avionics. Why is Jeff Immelt moving GE Avionics into a global joint venture with AVIC? Avionics are not labor intensive. The cost of production will not be less in China. The quality will not be better, probably not as good. What's going on? The answer is that China has an industrial policy. It has a 5-year plan in which it has identified avionics and aviation as a pillar industry for development of an indigenous capability in China for the future. GE's executives have read the plan. They've also read that America doesn't have a plan. And they've listened to the president's press conference that we're going to help the Chinese develop their own commercial jet. And GE knows that if they want to sell avionics in China, they better bloody well make the avionics in China. And so that's what they're doing, and there's no pushback from the US. When Jeff made that announcement, there was no call to Jeff from the administration or from anybody in Washington saying, hey, Jeff, you're supposed to be chairman of the President's Commission on Jobs. What's going on? And so my point is that the whole policy environment is such as to encourage or to justify kind of gradual transfer of the production of tradable goods and services out of the US. And that will need to be addressed in order to achieve Arvind's renaissance. And just to lead into Jennifer, let me say that we have a terrific opportunity. Some important things have happened. Arvind made the point about the rising costs abroad and the supply chain complexity, which has become evident in the wake of the tsunami in Japan and the floods in Thailand. And we've had a big break on cheap energy. Natural gas coming out of shale gives the US an enormous potential advantage if we can figure out how to use it. Jennifer, tell us how.
All right, thank you, Clyde. So we had an optimist, we had a slightly less optimistic perspective, and my job and Tim's job is to provide the realistic perspective. And I'm going to talk about that realism from 2 time frames. We're going to start with June 2006, and boy, were those the days if you were in the building materials construction industry. We at USG, who we believe were the most innovative manufacturer of building construction products, we were flying high. We had 2 million housing starts a year. We had 11 billion square feet of sheetrock brand wallboard flying off of our lines in the highest speed plants in the world. It was like watching cash being printed. It was so much fun to be in the plants. We had 14,000 employees and 70 plants, most of those in North America. And we had recently invested almost $1 billion, over $900 million, in adding capital to those plants and building new plants. And we also put in new technology for our entire supply chain processes. At the same time, we had another $500 million in capital projects that were underway. and $50 million that we had spent on R&D. So times were great. And then ultimately, we had been facing asbestos litigation and reached a landmark settlement with the plaintiffs' trust that allowed us to emerge from that asbestos-driven bankruptcy for a $4 billion settlement, but we kept our principles intact and we paid our shareholders in full. So we were feeling really good in the middle of 2006, and then the clouds hit the horizon. The housing crisis was becoming clear, and all of a sudden, in a very short course of time, our market shrunk by 50% and then shrunk by 50% again. So we went from 2 million housing starts to 1 million housing starts to the last few years of a 500,000 plus housing starts. It's been devastating to be a manufacturing company in those situations. We had to idle plants. We focused on our older, higher cost plants. We slashed overhead, first 20%, then 10%, then another 10%, and continuously we still evaluate our overhead levels. We curtailed our capital investments to about 10% of where we'd been. And our real focus in our manufacturing business was how to preserve cash flow and liquidity to get us through this horrible, horrible recession. So it has been a really tough 6 years to be a manufacturer in the building products industry in North America. And indeed, it's been really tough to be president of the division that's in charge for all of the growth in the rest of the world. Because as you look at the economic growth around the world, there's tremendous opportunity for manufacturing. And we have to find ourselves in the position to respond to fixing what's gone on in North America and respond as the business comes back. And at the same time, deploy our capital appropriately around the world to respond to those other emerging markets where people need places to live, work, and play. So now as we react to this new normal, I view it that there's 3 critical elements that we have to focus on. We have to make products that meet market needs, we have to make high-quality products, and we have to have it at the lowest cost. So you'd think those 3 things are pretty easy, particularly given the optimism. The first one, meeting market needs, requires innovation. And for us, this is something that we have a long history of and we're very proud of. We've been awarded over 1,000 patents just in the last decade. I know many people unfamiliar with the gypsum construction business don't view us as being particularly innovative, but it's a tremendously innovative industry. And the good news is that our technology is valued both by our customers and also by our competitors. And last year, we announced the most significant product introduction in our industry in decades, a new sheetrock brand ultralight panel that is 30% lighter and 20% stronger. And when you think about what that means to a contractor, someone who is carrying the equivalent of an elephant, 2,000 pounds, to build a house, that 30% less than that saves their backs, saves their boss's workers' comp, saves on transportation costs. Everything about it, end to end, is innovative and very exciting. But the other side of innovation is the fact that we have to have policies that protect that. In 2009, we won a lawsuit against one of our North American competitors, a $105 million settlement that we filed against them for infringement on both patent and trade secrets. And so when we look at this future growth and we look at making decisions around where we're going to build our plants, enforcement of intellectual property is extremely important. Going along with that in innovation, we need the talent, the engineers, the scientists, the researchers, the PhDs, who can turn those market needs, and they are different around the world. Even though a house is a house, what people want from that house is very different around the world. And so how do they turn those market needs into products that are both affordable and easy to get to the job sites? So I said there were 3 elements. The second element is high quality. And this really, in my mind, quality begins with your workforce. And we have to have dedicated, trained, local, hourly workforces in place. For us, one of the biggest sources of our quality is safety. Operating safely anywhere in the world is vital to our success. And this is something we don't treat lightly. We start every meeting with our safety performance, and we need people around the world, not just in the United States, who are willing to dedicate themselves to safe workplaces and safe practices. And then going along with that safety is the right technology to drive that quality. And here's our real challenge. We've talked about talent. 72% of this country does not graduate from college. Those people become our hourly workforce. And we're changing the capital that we put into our plants. We have much greater technology, much greater controls, much greater quality limits. And so as a result, we need to make sure that our kids are trained on technology, and the technology can't be social media and computer games. It's got to be real technology, and that starts with critical thinking, and it goes into statistical analysis and Shewhart charts and continuous improvement and Six Sigma and every other lean methodology that's out there. But we need people standing at the front end of our wallboard lines who can read the computer printouts, who understand when they see an out-of-control process, what they need to do out there on the line to get it back in control. Because those lines are flying at 600 feet a minute, it is cash being printed, and we cannot afford for it to stop. So then the third element, lowest cost. For us, really it boils down to the factor input costs. And for us, many of our raw materials are not produced in our local markets. Many are. And we're vertically integrated where it makes sense. We own quarries, we own ships, we own paper mills, and we own then actually the distribution all the way through. So we need to make sure that we have access to raw materials around the world and that we do have free trade agreements in place that aren't putting unnecessary tariffs on our raw materials and also potentially on our exports to other markets. Our most important cost of goods sold, though, is energy. It takes a lot of energy to dry water out of a gypsum slurry and complete that chemical transformation. And so for us, we were seeing our costs go up as oil prices were going up during this crisis. And this natural gas boom that Michael talked about has been tremendous for our industry. And so we need to look at that long-term energy policy and the way in which we are going to ensure that we not only have access to good, clean sources of energy, but that it's consistent. And that's a big decision for us about where we put our plants around the world. And then finally, on lowest cost, is transportation cost to get products to our customers. Arvind commented on the total cost of the supply chain. And for us, I was once told by a consultant, and my apologies to a consultant, that we have a value density problem in our industry. And by that, they meant that we make really heavy, really cheap products. And so the cost to get them to market is frequently more expensive than the value of the product itself. And so as a result, we will always need North American manufacturing to serve our North American markets, and we will always need local manufacturing in emerging markets around the world to serve those emerging markets. And so in summary, the realist in me says we need intellectual property protection, not just in the United States, but around the world. I would be very cautious on taking our best, most secretive trade secrets and patent protections and putting them in many countries around the world. We need an immigration policy that attracts and retains talent. It shouldn't matter where those engineers are born, where those scientists were born. We need them. We need local education and funding in both the junior highs and high school on the science, technology, engineering, and math curriculums. We need those bilateral free trade agreements for our raw materials. And we need continued investment in infrastructure so that we can get our product to market.
Tim?
Thank you. I'm going to talk about a number of things that Jenny has already mentioned, but for those of you who don't know ITW, we are an $18 billion organization that really consists of 9 different strategic business segments. And each of our business segments determines what the best manufacturing strategy is to help it grow, to determine what technologies to invest in, and so forth. And our operating principles, we tend to operate with minimal overheads, but we acquire and we develop technologies that can best help us compete in the markets where we compete. And we apply a principle called 80-20, which is a very effective tool across every business in the organization that helps us simplify businesses. Anyone who has been in a business that's been in existence for more than 10 years knows how complexity can grow on itself and continue to just limit the ability of the organization to thrive. So simplification is a big element that we universally believe in within ITW. But our strategic end-use markets are very broad. We compete in the energy transmission business, largely through our welding organization. We provide commercial and institutional food service to restaurants and prisons and the military. We have a consumer and industrial packaging business, the one I'm most affiliated with, and we make things like six-pack rings for beer cans and soft drink, and beer and soft drink cans and for soft drink bottles. We make a zipper for flexible packaging. We have a test and measurement business that provides testing equipment for laboratories to ensure accuracy of those labs. And then we've got a security printing and brand identity business that does things like passports and security features for driver's licenses. And then we also have an automotive business. Our automotive business has such brands as Rain-X, and if you've got a relatively new Ford, you probably have a gas tank without a gas cap on it. That was developed by ITW. So it's a broad spectrum of technologies and businesses that we compete in, and so it's not a universal manufacturing approach, but it is relative to 80-20. And as we look at where we put our businesses, it's really to enable us to compete and manufacture nearest the markets that are the fastest growing and are most strategic to us. We do very little production in emerging markets that comes back to the United States as an import. What we do is produce in the areas where we look to sell the product. And a lot of our investment over the last couple of years has been to meet those emerging market needs. China and Brazil are two good examples. But we have I think, a general preference to operate in the United States. It's much more of a comfortable environment for us for a number of reasons. And so we tend to have that preference, and Jenny mentioned the issue of intellectual property. Intellectual property is extremely important to ITW. We have over 19,000 patents. We have 12,000 brands within the organization. And 10 of the last 11 years, we have been in the top 100 in terms of patent recipients. So intellectual property is very important. How does that affect our manufacturing strategies? In many cases, we will not put the high end of an intellectual property technology into an emerging market. If we have to sell it there, we'll sell the non-proprietary end of the product in the emerging market and supply the proprietary element of it primarily from the United States. In all the countries where we compete, we have the same philosophy relative to ethics, environmental standards, and relative to the way we treat our people. So in no instance are the decisions to manufacture outside of the United States driven by a desire to avoid any of those important elements. Some of our businesses will have a process where we're able to put a plant or part of a facility into a country where we know that the business may not last there for a long term. So it's a plant that is designed and developed in order to allow it to be relocated as the needs of our customers and the needs of the market change. And then strategic differentiation. It kind of ties into the intellectual property element, but we have a strong desire to create strategic differentiation within our businesses. And we like systems businesses. We like to be able to manufacture a piece of equipment and supply a commodity that's related to or applied by that piece of equipment. So in some cases, we will manufacture the equipment in one location and the commodity in another. So there are a whole wide range of manufacturing strategies within the company. And it really depends upon the business that's involved in it and how they choose to go about meeting the needs of their customers. And then we also have we recognize that if we're going to be global leaders in the markets that we serve, in these 9 strategic platforms, we have to make some of our products in those markets to meet the needs locally of our customers. So we make those decisions on a platform by segment basis. And it's important not only in terms of meeting the needs of the customers, but you have to understand the customers locally. You have to understand the local trends, the local customs, and the competitive landscape within those markets. So those are all important factors in terms of how we go about setting our various manufacturing strategies. Now, I strongly agree that bringing manufacturing back to a stronger role within the United States is very important. It's very important for the companies that are based here. It's also very important for the country. One of the previous speakers mentioned the multiplier effect. It's estimated that for every manufacturing job that's brought into the United States, there's a multiplier of about 1.4 of other related jobs that are tied to it. And that might be a supplier supplying plastic resin, it might be construction jobs, it might be capital equipment suppliers, but there's about a 1.4 multiple on manufacturing jobs. It's about half that on non-manufacturing jobs. So it's very important in terms of building back the whole infrastructure of jobs within the United States. Manufacturing jobs also have a value-adding element to them. We tend to use manufacturing to take a material and improve it, add value to it, and make a product that hopefully is proprietary and has significant value to the customer that's using it. But for economies that are based upon commodities or raw materials, they have less of an opportunity to bring value added to that product, and less of an opportunity to control their margins, all of which are important things. Manufacturing draws on a broad spectrum of capabilities and talents within the communities they serve, whether it's engineers or whether it's manufacturing and operations people or salespeople or accounting people. They bring a broad spectrum of career opportunities to the communities they serve. And then, as was mentioned before, manufacturing drives innovation. I'm a big believer in that, but not just product innovation, but also process innovation. Most of the process innovation driven out of ITW comes from our manufacturing plants, where we really work with the product and the systems and the equipment every day, and drive value out of that. And then lastly, we need to get back to a point where we like manufacturing again. In the 1970s, manufacturing was at a much higher level in the United States than it is today. And I think the aspirational roles of Americans went from working in a manufacturing job to working in a white-collar job. Most of our parents, if we grew up in the 1970s, wanted us to be lawyers, doctors, accountants, and so forth. So the aspirational roles change within America, and that hasn't come back. So the the way we communicate what manufacturing is really important. Because today's manufacturing jobs are not the coal mine imagery and they're not the steel mill imagery. They are clean, safe environments. As Jenny said, they require the ability to think, the ability to create on the fly and make improvements to the process. And they really, in most cases, require a background in electronics or possibly design or some other area that is more than just what we're learning in our high schools today, or in some cases even our colleges. So I think businesses have an opportunity to work with, and we've seen some examples of this around the country, work with institutions, whether it's high schools or colleges, to try to design some curricula that yields the kind of skills that we're needing. Whether it's running a piece of equipment, running an involved extrusion process, or just working in a fairly simple manufacturing process, it requires more than it did 20 years ago in terms of skills. And then one final comment related to that, I think the rhetoric about business needs to change. I think businesses provide value not only in jobs, not only in supporting the tax base of the communities that they serve, but I also think and know that businesses provide a lot of funding for the arts of our communities, our museums, nonprofit organizations that need support. None of those things would be thriving without the help of businesses. So the way business is communicated within this country, it needs to be reinforced in a positive way, not in a negative way. So I like to say at ITW, we like manufacturing. Thank you.
Okay, Tim, thank you. Thank you all to the members of the panel. And let me sort of focus in here a little bit on Tim and Jenny. I think the way you describe your firms, it shows how diverse the manufacturing sector really is. Here's Jenny in a firm that ran the housing bubble up and then plummeted down with it as well. Tim in a firm that is incredibly diverse. I know quite a bit about ITW. It's an incredibly diverse firm that uses this 80-20 approach in a very effective way. We don't have time to go into it tonight, but if any of you really want to learn how a diverse company can run diverse businesses very effectively, very efficiently, get that story, that 80-20 story. But tell me, how much of your business is international, Tim? How much of your sales are outside the U.S.?
ITW's business is about 55% outside the United States in terms of the end-use markets.
Right. And Jenny, what about you?
If we include Canada as international?
It's international.
All right. If we include Canada as international, our international business is about a third of our revenue, including our joint ventures.
Yeah, they would not want to be considered part of the United States,
yes.
I can assure you. So both truly global companies, and I think you describe very effectively the way that you serve you produce in local markets and serve in local markets. So let me be a little pointed here. Now, you've all said we want to increase manufacturing in the United States. We're all for increased manufacturing. So let me ask you this question. The fact that a product is not being produced in the United States, it must be because it's lower cost, in most cases, to produce it somewhere else. So the consumer benefits from the lower cost. So if we were to somehow bring all of these products from that we import, let's say, from other countries and bring them into the United States and produce them here, the cost is going to be higher in most cases. The cost would be higher. Consumer would pay more. Is that a good deal for the consumers? Arvind?
So I mean, I think that, no, I think it's not. And that's the reason why I think it has to be driven by economics. Because if I, as a consumer, I go and I have choice between two LCD TV sets, which are exactly identical, and one is 25% more and it's made in the US, I'm going to buy the imported set. So I think there are two reasons why this has to be an economic choice. One is consumers. Also, I think if you think about, you look at the CEOs of major US-based companies who have global businesses, and you ask them what drives their decisions. Their decisions are driven by economics because they are liable, they are accountable to their shareholders, who are actually, at the end of the day, who care about profits. That's why I think when we look at this, I think our view is that the decisions which will change the course of manufacturing in this country have to be driven by sound economics, so the consumer is the winner and the shareholders are the winners.
Clyde, what do you think? Is it a good deal for consumers?
Yeah, let me take the opposite side. I would say that, yes, it is actually good for American consumers for a couple of reasons. One is that the stuff that's being produced overseas is not necessarily being produced overseas because it's less expensive. I just pointed out a number of examples where production has been transferred overseas for various non-economic.
This is the geopolitical
Yeah.
argument, okay?
Or I mean, another major factor is currency. The dollar, all of the Asian countries intervene, as you know, frequently in currency markets in order artificially to keep the dollar strong. So, this is a distortion of the free markets that we say we believe in. And those distortions eventually work to the detriment of consumers. And then that leads to the third point, which is that this division of consumers, we talk about consumers as if it's some distinct kind of being. Remember, consumers are also workers. And workers who don't have jobs can't buy very much. And so by moving production back, you create employment, which gives people jobs and allows them to buy. The last point is that most of what we're talking about are products that are characterized by economies of scale. Let me take you all the way back to the 1860s. We think of Abraham Lincoln here in Illinois as the great emancipator. He could just as well be called the great protector. He raised tariffs higher than any American president ever has. And the argument against him at the time was that this was going to hurt American consumers, would drive up the cost of imports. But in fact, what it did was it made it possible to produce in the United States and achieve enormous economies of scale so that the U.S. producers became the low-cost producers. And so if you transfer this production back to the U.S. and you get economies of scale, you then make the U.S. into the low-cost production location, and workers and consumers are all better off.
I would just say macroeconomists would question that argument.
Well, but macroeconomists are a weird kind
Let's
of being.
go on. Jenny, what do you think?
Well, I actually challenge the hypothesis that it is lower cost to manufacture outside of the United States, particularly when you're in producing a product that does have such a significant amount of raw material in it. So for us, what's interesting is it's lower cost probably to build a plant outside of the United States, but actually once that plant is built, to produce a product is roughly pretty equivalent. And so
But that's part of the cost of production, the cost of the plant.
it is part of the cost of production, but I think that there's this general sense that American manufacturing, American labor costs, American transportation costs are much higher. And I think really looking at what is the source of that higher cost, and that it's that it really is in that upfront building of the plant, not in the variable cost of production. Your variable costs are pretty equivalent. And so I think changing our thoughts around what is it that we need to do to build a plant in the United States can change some of that equation, I guess is my perspective on that.
Tim?
I would agree with that. I think by and large, the way we look at things, if a market is based in the United States, we would probably produce it in the United States. Whether we can make it in China cheaper, that's not much of a decision on our part. But to me, it is how you create value for your customers. The world and technology changes so quickly. The life of a product as it's developed, if it's a successful product, will change so much I mean, it is such a short lifespan that it has, that it'll be improved upon by someone else within a very short period of time. So unless you have the incentives built in, as Jenny said, to build the facility less expensively, and then provide the incentives in terms of innovation tax credits or whatever, companies need to continue to innovate, and it's a never-ending process.
And
if
they
they're going to
have.
be successful.
And that's the big success story in U.S. manufacturing, is exactly what you said. Arvind mentioned it briefly, talked about productivity improvement. I mean, that's really the success of U.S. manufacturing. If you look at our productivity in manufacturing in the U.S. increases more rapidly than productivity in the rest of the economy. And as a result, the relative price of manufactured goods comes down relative to all the other prices in our economy. And as a result, when you look at our GDP, that's one of the reasons that when you measure manufacturing in dollar terms, it gets smaller as a percentage of our GDP because of the efficiency, because of the productivity improvement. This is the great success of our manufacturing sector. And someone gave me some statistics. They said that in 1950, if it took 1,000 workers to produce a certain product on average in manufacturing, it would today 170 workers. 170, difference between 1,000 to 170. That's the success of U.S. manufacturing, and that's why, I mean, the argument that there could be, there is a renaissance that can take place here is because of the innovation that you talked about, or economists use the term productivity improvement, but it's the same thing. It's getting better and better at doing it every step of the way. Now, part of that you all mentioned is people, is talent. And in our prior discussions, I know you're concerned about the fact, well, Tim, you said people don't want to go into manufacturing. They want to go into a white-collar job, or we're not able to attract people into manufacturing. Here we have an 8.2% unemployment rate in the United States, higher in this state. I mean, why can't we attract people? Are we paying enough for them? I mean, should we raise the salaries of people in manufacturing? Is that why? I mean, why do we have these gaps? Anyone?
Well, I think that on the compensation side of things, I think the rates vary by region, but tend to create good middle-class living standards. In terms of the right talents coming out of school, I really think that we have to get more specific in terms of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And as I said before, if someone wants to have an assured opportunity for a more assured opportunity for employment coming out of school, they need to be encouraged to get into those kinds of curriculums and understand up front that that's important and for that reason. I mean, it used to be, well, if you're going to get anywhere, get a good job, you got to go to college. Well, that is not necessarily true today. And I think we have to get more specific about the things that the young people learn in school and the outcomes that are expected in order for them to be able to compete in the job market, because it's competition.
Mm-hmm. Let me add a point, Michael. One is, it's a little bit of, I think, a chicken and egg. There's been, I mean, we tend to think of job training as something that takes place in school or university, but an awful lot of job training takes place on the job. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't have the job, if you don't have any more forging industry, then there's no place to learn forging. If you don't do circuit boards anymore, there's no place to learn to do circuit boards. And so partly the erosion of skills has proceeded as the erosion of manufacturing has taken place. And so by encouraging a return of manufacturing, I think you get some degree of return of that skill development capability. But a second thing I think is very important in the context of what Tim is saying is that we used to have in the U.S. Apprenticeships and programs that kids didn't have to go to college, but they learned skills. The Germans are great at this. It's fantastic. Germany's, the percentage of Germans who have a university degree is very low. But what the Germans do is they go and they get certified as a lens grinder or some other highly skilled thing, and they get jobs. Maybe we need to look at a resurrection of that kind of thing in the U.S. as well.
Well, and I think
Jenny and then Arvind, go ahead.
along those lines, our challenge, we unfortunately have laid off so many people in the last 6 years that when we do add a shift back to a plant, and our plants are typically in very small towns, it's not very difficult for us to attract some of our former employees because we are viewed as an employer of choice. But we now have a bifurcated workforce. We've got a group of people who have 25 plus years with our company on our hourly workforce. And then as we're going to add staff back, we're going to be attracting a much younger generation. If they don't have the apprenticeships or the training in high school or the background, and our older workers retire, they're not going to have that same opportunity to learn and move up through the ranks and really understand some of the complexities of our manufacturing process. And so we are going to be looking for other sources of training and education, or we're going to have to invest in it ourselves. And then amongst our professional staff, we can't get enough engineers. There are not enough engineers in this country who are interested in manufacturing. They're all interested in Wall Street.
What are you paying?
Well, we will evaluate that. But I think I think there's actually two other issues. It's not salary as much as it is the attractiveness of moving to a small town. Southern Oklahoma is not the hotbed of society 70 miles outside of Oklahoma City. It's a great place to visit, but it's not a place that an engineer coming out of a major university really has as top of their list to move to. And that's where our manufacturing facilities are located, are towns like that. And so, we secondly have always had an expectation that people move from city to city, small town to small town, as they move up through the manufacturing ranks. And we're realizing that we have to change our perspective on that as well.
Arvind?
There's a couple of things. I mean, I think first of all, and some of us have touched on this, but I think there's a difference between low skilled versus highly skilled, right? So you read about examples where there's a posting of 10 jobs and 1,000 people apply. But at the same time, we know, because we did a number of interviews as part of our study, that Siemens has 3,500 jobs open and they can't actually find the right set of people to go fill those jobs. So I think the problem is real. I think the perception issue, which I think, Tim, you talked a lot about, is a big one as well. And it's not just awareness. I believe it's also making sure companies are actually creating a career path. The problem right now in a lot of companies is there is no career path. You go there and you get stuck. And the younger generation actually wants to see a path where they can keep moving and go on to the next level. I think the second point I would make is, and this again came out loud and clear in our research when we were doing the study, is that there are actually good success examples of where some US states have done a tremendous job. You look at what South Carolina has done in terms of partnering with the businesses. And this is very local. I mean, this is where I think the local community colleges play a big role where, for example, they actually, even before you have set up the plant, they work with you to identify what kind of job needs you will have, what kind of training they will need. So they build that into their curriculum, and by the time your plant is up and running, you actually have a stream of people who can go join.
And this is, by the way, a very high priority for Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, too, to tie in the Chicago community colleges with business firms and specific skill training. All right, so we now going to open this up for questions from the floor, and we have one over there. If you could just tell us right back there, your name and stand up, please.
Sure. My name is Dave Jones, and I was very intrigued by the relative efficiency of manufacturing in this country over the past number of years. Anyone paying for a college education these days knows that we have not achieved that kind of efficiency in higher education. I'm wondering, Professor Moskow, do you think we ought to take the professors and make them spend their sabbatical year on the floor at ITW and USG?
Well,
That's not actually my question. but
yeah,
please.
the answer is productivity does not increase in higher education, and that's why. So any salary increase goes through to price increase.
Yeah,
It's the same thing. The polar example, of course, is symphony orchestras. You can't play Beethoven's Fifth any faster. You can't increase productivity. So any salary increase has to be passed through the ticket price increases.
My question was actually, are unions, are they on board with bringing manufacturing back to this country? This has been very much a current issue here in the Midwest. What has been your experience with the various unions that you probably have to deal with, and both Arvind and Mr. Prestowitz's perspective?
Your question is, are the unions opposed to bringing manufacturing back?
Are they an asset? Are they on board with getting the jobs?
Okay.
The jobs we're talking
Are
about?
they
changing the way
willing to quote pay their share?
Correct.
In order to help start a new plant or bring jobs back here?
Well, we have a fairly low union population within ITW, partly because of the nature of the businesses and the size of the businesses and so forth. But I would say that they are, the approach of unions is very important as to how we get back there. All right, this is my perspective, but it's such a competitive world that we're in. No matter where you produce, it's such a competitive world that if you have any two elements, doesn't matter whether it's two managers or a workforce and management, any two elements that aren't working in the same direction with the same objectives can't end up surviving. They have to be moving with the same objectives in the same direction.
And in the United States, we are not unionized. And so I have a number of unions in plants around the world, but it's a very different dynamic. And so I don't have any experience with it here in the US.
I'd say it's a mixed bag. I think on the one hand, the big US unions are maybe the major promoters of manufacturing in the US. I'm thinking particularly of the steel workers. Steel workers is not really the right name for them because they encompass a wide range of industries that are not steel. But the Alliance for American Manufacturing is probably the major organization promoting manufacturing in Washington, and it is an organization of the Steel Workers Union. Actually, in the last steel agreement, part of the deal was that 5 cents per ton of steel produced goes into a fund to promote manufacturing. And that's the Alliance for American Manufacturing. Leo Gerard, the head of the Steelworkers Union, is a tireless, energetic, dynamic leader promoting manufacturing in the US. So that's the plus side. I think the downside here is not so much the unions themselves, but the way labor law works in the US. Just a quick example, let's take Detroit, since we have so much experience with the auto industry and unions. So the way that bargaining works in the US, you have an industry-wide union, which is a monopoly element in the production system. And the union, whether it's auto or whoever it is, but the way it works is the union then negotiates company by company. So the union picks a company and they say, okay, you're going to be our model, and we're going to strike you, or we're going to negotiate with you first. If you don't do a deal, we'll strike you. But the other two companies, or in the auto industry case, are out of it. So it gives the union enormous leverage against a particular company. I find Germany fascinating because wages are much higher than in the US. And German cars are very competitive. But in Germany, very powerful unions. But the industry bargains with the union as a whole. So you get an auto agreement, not a GM agreement, and then a Chrysler and a Ford agreement. So I think the dynamics of the way labor law works in the US tends to be kind of counterproductive to having an industry strategy or industry kind of wide support. And I think that the dynamics of union elections are such as to reward kind of short-term activity that may not necessarily be positive in the long term.
Okay, let's get a next question. One right here.
Hello, Karen Kane. Thank you all so very much. What an amazing panel. But the subtext that I heard as you all spoke was that manufacturing had this PR problem, that somehow it was okay that we got rid of it. So if that's the case, how do you ensure that that doesn't happen again in this renaissance that we're talking about?
Well, we haven't gotten rid of it.
It fell out of favor. I mean, it certainly wasn't, for example.
It does have, it has a PR problem. You're exactly right. And I mean,
So
I
if you
think
talk about
Tim
it,
has
there
made
you
the point, and Jennifer.
So how do we,
has made the point.
well, is there a PR problem? Let me ask the people in the audience, first of all. Is there anyone here who works in manufacturing beside the two people on the platform? Okay, we have a few, that's good, okay. But does this audience look with disfavor on manufacturing firms or people who work in manufacturing firms? So I'm not sure, I'm not sure there's a.
What I heard was the whole idea of getting younger people to see it as a career objective rather than working for Groupon with a headset like you're in India, but you can wear jeans and you're really cool. So, I mean, what is it that, and the satisfaction we've sort of lost touch with, the satisfaction of working with your hands and innovating. I guess I feel like that story is not promulgated the way.
Yeah, and I would take the German example of that. And young people in Germany are very competitive about getting those opportunities to learn and be an apprentice within a particular industry. And whether they end up in that industry as a lifelong career or whether it's a learning process and then they move on to something else, they're developing the skills not only to be successful in that business, but they're also developing skills in terms of how to work in an organization and how to innovate around the product that you're producing. So I think that yes, we do have some element of whether it's corporation bashing or manufacturing as not having the right imagery, and a lot of people not understanding what the new manufacturing facility is designed to do and looks like. Yeah, I think we still have some of that imagery.
Jenny, we have a PR problem?
I don't know if the PR problem, it's interesting, is manufacturing as much as it is the PR problem around the size of cities or where a lot of plants are located.
Okay, it's a location problem then.
Potentially.
Yeah. There are lines of people who want to be electricians. There are thousands of people who would like to be electricians. They can't get jobs. Right now, obviously, the construction industry is flat in its back, so they can't get jobs, but there are lots of people who want to be electricians, carpenters, plumbers. People want these jobs, but they're just not available now. And we talked about apprenticeship programs. There are apprenticeship programs for all of those trades, and there are lines of people trying to get into those apprenticeship programs. Okay, let's hear someone with authority. Let me get the microphone here. And please, is this a question or a comment?
It's a comment.
Your name, please?
Karen Carrick from McGladrey. But like right now, there are 500,000 open positions in the United States in the manufacturing industry. So it's not the carpenters and the plumbers, but it is, the welders and people that work on CNC machines. We're not attracting those individuals into the manufacturing industry because it's not, quote unquote, cool to be in manufacturing. So part of it is an image problem, but part of it is, communicating to young people that you can have a great career in manufacturing. And it's just, for whatever reason, and part of it is that you know, growing up in the 70s, I grew up in Detroit, it was like you would not ever think of going into manufacturing because all the jobs were getting eliminated. And there have been a big reduction in the manufacturing jobs in the United States, but what's happened now is that there are open positions and there's not people there to fill those positions.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and we've got lots of hands here, so Josh, you pick the person.
Mike, hi. Jim Kurtz. I'm from Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we have a real problem too. There's a company that's run by the Germans, and they can't find enough people to come, even working with the manufacturing. I've been in Germany, and I also talked to some of my friends in Germany, and one of their big concerns is getting people in manufacturing. They work with those kids when they're real little, and they test them, and they peg them to things that they have interest in. They keep on hammering, this is your path that you will take. So this is what they do. I just came back from China.
Is there a question?
I just wanted, in terms of how can we encourage people? And in China, they're doing the same thing. They're not interested in manufacturing. So how do we refocus the interest in manufacturing? That's the big thing. Whether it's China, I want to do computer work, I want to do things. So that's the big focus. In Wisconsin, how do we get people interested?
All right, Josh, one more person.
Hi, thank you. My name is Claire Tram. I'm curious, you've spoken a lot about federal policy, and you touched a little bit on community college initiatives here in Chicago and elsewhere. I'm wondering what you think that cities and regions and perhaps states can do to foster manufacturing, what policies, what partnerships, what initiatives would help to rebuild.
Okay, good question.
Well, there's a lot of things, and I think Arvind mentioned South Carolina. Almost every state has an economic development office. Many cities do as well. And I mean, if you look at the size of a city like Chicago, it's bigger than a city-state like Singapore. If I were Chicago, the first thing I'd do is send a team to Singapore and investigate Singapore's Economic Development Board and looking at what Singapore does to attract industry and to attract technology. That's a whole range of things. It goes from sitting down with potential investors and employers and finding out what are their needs going to be, and then getting the school systems lined up with them, or getting the unions into the discussions. It's tax breaks. It's regulatory allowances or flexibility. Essentially, you know, the key here is not a particular program. The key is that there's a high-level commitment to attracting manufacturing and to attracting business and making it work.
Arvind?
I would like to add a point. I mean, I think one of the things as we were doing the research for the study we found was there's significant value in clusters. So if you look at the Silicon Valley cluster, or you look at the pharmaceuticals cluster in eastern Massachusetts, or in fact, if you look at how China has created some clusters around apparels, shoes, or electronics. So I think when we think about as states, as cities, there is value in thinking about what are the potential emerging clusters in that particular area, and how you can seed those clusters by the right set of policies, by having the right kind of programs and research at the universities. I would say, like, with the exception of maybe countries like China, usually Western countries haven't had a great success in predicting clusters. So it's not about saying, okay, I'm going to set up this big thing here, let's put all the money here. But it's more about recognizing those early trends and then creating favorable conditions so people who work in those companies can connect. They have alternative options. You have universities and professors nearby. You have suppliers who can work with you to co-design, reduce design times, and so on. So I think there is a lot you can do in this particular space to encourage manufacturing.
Jenny, Tim, any final comment?
I would add to what Clyde said and say that I think it revolves around the proper incentives. A lot of small towns and big cities in the United States have lost manufacturing jobs, and it is a competitive environment where you have to go out and provide the incentives as a town or as a city, provide the incentives for new business opportunity to be developed. You may have to forego 10 years of tax base revenue, but the 100 or so jobs that you might bring in will do more benefit than what you would derive from the tax base.
And I think my last piece to that is having a level of infrastructure that can connect cities. You talk about Wisconsin. We do a lot of our innovation in our research center in Libertyville. It is very difficult to drive down to Chicago to UIC or down to University of Illinois or IIT. I mean, you're 50 miles away, you're stuck in traffic to go out to University of Wisconsin or anywhere else. And so really looking at what is the right infrastructure, be it rail or better highways or other options to link those university centers into the innovation centers in a much tighter way. I think that's one of my dreams and visions for how that all fits together in 50 years.
It's a good vision, absolutely. Just a footnote on this. In Chicago, World Business Chicago has been working actively on this and has a number of projects underway. And the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has a task force focusing on attracting foreign direct investment into the Chicago metropolitan area. So I think there is a lot going on here in our community. So Arvind, Clyde, Jenny, Tim, thank you so much on behalf of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and thank you all. You've been a great audience.